Hi and welcome to another edition of ChinnyVision. This time we're going to look at Sega Ages on the Saturn. For years and years we'd had home conversions of popular Sega arcade games that simply couldn't live up to the quality of the arcade originals. Thinking of games like Space Harrier on the Master System and Space Harrier 2 on the Mega Drive and also Afterburner. But with the power of the new Sega Saturn, for the first time we could have those games in the home. And in Japan, Sega released lots of volumes of Sega Ages, of games like Fantasy Zone, Columns, and all sorts of different games. In the UK, we only got one release on the Saturn. It's just called Sega Ages, and it has Space Harrier, Outrun, and Afterburner 2 on it. And that's what we're going to look at today. So there's 3 games on one disc, all supposedly exact recreations of the arcade games. So we're going to start off with Outrun, and we get a loading screen here. Sega not letting us forget who created these games. So we have a slightly different menu screen there with different options.
Get ready.
And here we go. And yeah, this seems to be a pretty accurate conversion of the arcade. I think this is running a little bit smoother than the arcade, so let's compare it against the version in MAME. I think we're running at a far faster frame rate than the arcade. The arcade runs at 30 frames a second, and checking up on this version runs at 50 frames a second in PAL and 60 frames a second in NTSC. So we've got extra frames there that really add to the fluidity of the game. Other than that, graphically it seems to be absolutely identical, as does the sound, which you've got all the tunes here from the arcade. One slight criticism is I don't like the handling on the Saturn's digital joypad. There's no subtlety here. Now if you play this in MAME like I do, I play this on a Xbox controller and use the analog thumbstick to control, so you get the analog feel from the arcade. But other than that, it seems to be a really, really solid port. Certainly at this time, this was the only way you could play an arcade quality version of Outrun in your home. I started playing around with MAME a few years after this, and believe you me, in those days it was pretty rough. But no, this all seems to be here. One slight criticism of this over the MAME version is that even if you put this into an arcade mode, which you access via a few key presses you can find online, the problem is that you only get so many continues, and this is the same for all the games. In MAME you can continue putting your 50p's or 10p's in as if it was an arcade machine, but on this version unfortunately you get so many continues and that's it. And frankly as well, that's an undocumented feature, because if I have to go on the internet to find out how to do that to begin with, and it's not included in the manual, then effectively you've got to play these games on 1 credit. Over to a favourite of mine, Space Harrier. It'd be interesting to see if this has a different frame rate. Just turning up my lives there. Can't turn it up to 9 lives, which I certainly used to play. I'm putting 50p in the arcade itself, see. I used to have the full 9 lives, so I'm getting 4 here, or 5 effectively.
Welcome to the family. Get ready.
I think this is running close to what the arcade runs at, personally, in terms of frame rate. Again, it all seems to be here, and the same gripe as Outrun. Digital joystick, and therefore you don't get that analog feel that the arcade had, and that you get playing on MAME with an Xbox controller or other type of analog controller. Doesn't seem to pull back to the middle as the arcade does either. Over to the arcade version, and you can see it's pretty much identical. One thing I have noticed is the screen's aspect ratio is slightly different. On the Saturn here, the screen is slightly circling in PAL, stretched horizontally. I expect that's because the game's running in PAL as opposed to NTSC. If we're running this in NTSC, I think we'd probably find that the little aspect ratio differences there would be ironed out. Again, these are all minor gripes. For the time, this was pretty much the most accurate way you could play Space Harrier in your home. It's certainly miles ahead of all the other home ports.
You're doing great.
And like many of the arcade games I've played, I first came across this game, Space Harrier, in the arcade at Clarence Pier at Southsea. And I remember the machine arriving and being parked at the front of the arcade. It wasn't turned on for a few weeks. And people just were looking at this hydraulic monster that had appeared. And then when it was turned on, you used to have to queue up to play it, and there'd always be a crowd around the machine. And you get your 3 lives for 20p or 9 lives for 50p. And back then, 50p was a lot of money to be putting into an arcade machine. Most games were 10p, sometimes 20p. Overall, Space Harrier on Saturn, same thoughts as Outrun, really. This one actually does appear to be an exact copy of the arcade version. Moving over to Afterburner. And this is a game that really relies on fast scaling and a lot of processing power. I've got this installed on my MAME on a little Acer Revo computer, and it has to be said, even on a modern PC like that, Afterburner slightly skips a few frames as you take off from the aircraft carrier. So it is quite an intense thing to process, so it's good to see it here on the Saturn running so well. So here's the arcade version here quickly, and as you can see it's pretty much identical, just that slight aspect ratio difference thing. Same frame rates, looks exactly the same, completely accurate. Of all these 3 games, Afterburner is my least favourite because it just seems to rely a little bit less on skill, and it's also fast, and you just end up mashing the fire button when it says fire, and I don't know, some people love it, and I love the speed it moves at, and I love the atmosphere, but as a game, I've always thought it's a little bit limited. So, given the fact that you can get MAME these days, and you can play all these games on your PC for free effectively, why should you get Sega Ages on the Saturn? Well, for Space Harrier and Afterburner, I'd say yeah, probably not worth it. But that version of Outrun, running at 50 frames a second in PAL or 60 frames a second in NTSC, that is definitely a reason to get this, because you can't do that on MAME because the original versions don't run at that frame rate. It really does add to the speed and enjoyment of the game. So for that reason alone, Sega Ages is definitely worth owning for your Saturn.